April 12th, 1843. Fort Granger, Louisiana. Write the date down the way they refused to. Because what happened that night was not a mistake, not a moment, not a private indulgence. It was a decision made under uniform, inside a system designed to make certain bodies speak only when commanded and vanish when inconvenient. Colonel Augustus Wainwright returned from inspection before sundown, boots still dusted with road grit, and called for Amara Bell by name. Not the girl, not the help. Her name. That detail matters because it proves intention. A man who can name you can also target you, inventory you, erase you, and later pretend he never knew you existed. Amara was 19. Black. Enslaved. No legal personhood. The colonel was 42, the highest authority within miles, and the paper trail of his authority did not end at military orders. It extended into the house, the fields, the clinic, the pulpit. When he summoned her to the rear corridor by the pantry door, it was not a request, and it was not seduction. It was an exercise of jurisdiction. He had the keys to the locks. He had the family's fear. He had the law on his side. That is what made the act forbidden only in whisper, never in court. The crime was not merely what he did to her body. The crime was what he expected the world to do afterward. Cooperate in silence. By April 1843, the Wainwright estate ran like a disciplined outpost. Records were kept for everything that made the plantation profitable. Cotton bales, mule feed, tool inventories, the births of livestock. The births of enslaved people were noted only when convenient, useful only as labor multiplication, or dangerous as inconvenient scandal. Wainwright understood optics. He understood inheritance. He understood that his surname was a weapon and a shield. That is why he did not rely on luck. He moved immediately to control the aftermath. Within a week of that night, Amara's work assignment changed. She was pulled from visible tasks and placed into indoor labor that kept her away from visitors. Pantry, laundry, back stairwell. A small demotion disguised as protection, because concealment is always sold as kindness when you're trying to hide a crime. May 1843. Doctor Silas Crow, the plantation physician, conducted an examination in the small clinic room behind the main house. He wrote findings in a ledger that should have remained permanent, because medicine demands documentation. But on the Wainwright property, medicine served power before it served truth. Crow recorded pregnancy indicators and estimated conception window. He wrote the date range that pointed backward, not to any husband, not to any peer of Amara's, but straight toward the colonel's April return. Those lines were the first threat to the Wainwright name because they were not rumor, they were ink. And ink outlives threats when it is allowed to remain. It did not remain. The ledger page was later torn out cleanly, the way a practiced hand removes evidence without shredding the binding. That absence, an empty stitch line where paper once was, is part of the record. Do not let anyone tell you missing evidence is nothing. Missing evidence is often the loudest confession. June 1843. The household knew. They always know. Walls do not prevent knowledge in a place where servants carry every message and every stain. Lenora Wainwright, the colonel's wife, did not confront her husband in public. She did not confront him in church. She confronted the logistics. Her instinct was not to ask whether the pregnancy was true. It was to ask who would be blamed and how quickly. That distinction is the difference between innocence and complicity. Lenora's strategy was damage control, not moral outrage. She ordered the cook to stop sending Amara to the front hall. She ordered the seamstress to alter Amara's dress cuts so any swelling could be disguised. She instructed the house supervisor to keep Amara away from guests for propriety. Propriety. A word used as perfume over rot. Propriety meant, keep the evidence out of sight until we decide what to do with it. July 1843. Colonel Wainwright signed what the workers later called the silence allowance. It was not called that in the books, of course. It was recorded as an extra ration stipend paid to a supervisor for household stability. But the timing speaks. The payment begins the same month whispers intensified. The recipient was Clyde Mercer, overseer of the holding farm beyond Baton Rouge, a man known for two talents: obedience and cruelty. You do not pay cruelty for stability unless you intend to use it. Mercer's role would become clear later, but here in 1843 it begins with money. Hush money that did not go to Amara, did not protect her, did not acknowledge her humanity, only ensured her containment. August 1843. Amara's body could no longer be hidden from those who handled her daily. The household responded the way this society always responded. It did not punish the powerful man. It punished the woman who could not refuse him. She was placed under tighter control. Her movement was reduced to a narrow route between laundry, pantry, and a small back room used for storage. Doors were locked early. Meals were delivered late. The point was not health, it was isolation. Isolation is how abusers manage the risk of witnesses. If you can separate the person from the community, you can rewrite the story without contradiction. September 1843. Doctor. Crow's demeanor changed. He began speaking less, writing less, leaving fewer notes. That is what fear looks like when it wears a doctor's coat. He had seen too much, and he understood something basic. On Wainwright property, truth was not a virtue. It was a liability. Crow had a choice: be a physician or be an accessory. He chose the latter. His compliance would later be disguised as professional discretion. But discretion that protects violence is not professionalism, it is participation. October 1843. The colonel began to craft the narrative he would later rely on. That if a child appeared, it would not be his. He leaned on the plantation's favorite myth, the myth that black women are naturally promiscuous, that their pregnancies are always suspicious, that their consent is irrelevant because their bodies are treated as communal property. This myth did not exist accidentally. It was engineered to protect men like him. It transformed assault into immorality, and it transformed the victim into the accused. Prosecutorial inversion. The guilty pointing at the powerless and calling it justice. Remember this mechanism, because it repeats across generations in different uniforms. November 1843. The preparations shifted from concealment to contingency. Lenora's relatives visited more often. Vivian Harrow, Lenora's cousin, arrived with unusual timing and stayed longer than social courtesy required. Her presence was explained as companionship. It was not companionship. It was planning. Powerful families do not improvise when inheritance is at stake. They convene. They bring in blood relatives who can keep a secret because the secret protects them too. If you want to understand how a dynasty survives a scandal, look for the relatives who suddenly appear to help. Help with what? With burying truth before it breathes. December 1843. Amara's pregnancy entered its final stage. This is when many stories romanticize a mother's hope. Do not romanticize what the system denied her. Amara could not prepare in the way free women could. She could not choose a name without permission. She could not demand a midwife she trusted. She could not secure a future for the child. Her hope, if it existed, lived in a space constantly threatened by violence and theft. The house knew that a birth was coming, and the house knew it would not be treated as a birth. It would be treated as a problem to solve. January was approaching, and with it, the moment when the Colonel's private crime would attempt to become public reality. The Wainwrights needed the world to see a clean lineage, a clean household, a clean name. They could not allow a black mother to be a permanent witness walking the grounds with proof in her arms. So they did what powerful families do when evidence arrives breathing. They planned to make the evidence disappear, and they planned to make the disappearance look ordinary. This is not speculation. This is the pattern. A missing ledger page. A sudden stipend. A tightened confinement order. A cousin's strategic arrival. Each piece is small enough to deny alone. Together, they form a mechanism, and mechanisms are not accidents. They are built. If you are waiting for me to ask politely whether Colonel Wainwright might have crossed a line, you are listening to the wrong document. He crossed it on April 12th, 1843, and then he ordered the world to pretend it was never there. The moral burden is not only on the man who commits the act. It is on everyone who helps him erase it. Doctors who tear pages, wives who manage optics, overseers who accept money, relatives who participate in the quiet. And it is also on us. Now, if we hear this and treat it as entertainment instead of record. Responsibility begins with naming. Name the date. Name the place. Name the people. Because forgetting is the final service the powerful demand, and it is the easiest service society keeps providing. January the 3rd, 1844. Wainwright Estate, outside Fort Granger. The night they later tried to describe as confusing was not confusing to the people in charge. It was scheduled, managed, and contained. A storm moved in after dusk, the kind that makes roads impassable and neighbors stay home. Convenient weather for a household that needed privacy. By midnight, 2 separate rooms were prepared for 2 separate stories. One story was for the public record, a respectable white birth in the Harrow line. The other was for the basement truth, an enslaved black woman giving birth to the Colonel's child, a birth that could not be allowed to exist under its real name. The household kept its lamps low, not because of the storm, but because darkness helps criminals feel protected. And criminals love conditions that make witnesses doubt what they saw. Amara Bell labored in a back room near the pantry corridor, the same corridor where she had been summoned in April. This symmetry matters. The estate used the same geography for the assault and the cover-up. That corridor was built to hide work from visitors. It became a pipeline for concealment. Dr. Silas Crow was present, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. A powerful man's scandal requires professional hands. Crow's role that night was not healer, it was gatekeeper. He controlled the facts that could later be sworn under oath. He controlled the language that turned a mother into a case, a baby into an issue, and a crime into an incident. If you want to understand how evil survives, watch how it recruits respectable jobs to do its dirty work. In the main house, another set of linens was laid out, another kettle boiled, another midwife summoned. Her name was Martha Pike. Remember it. Pike was not a family member, not a servant tied by ownership, but a hired midwife, an outsider whose signature carried weight in church registries and county records. That is why she was there. Credibility. The Wainwrights understood something essential about lies. A lie needs official ink. It needs a witness with clean hands. It needs a woman who can say, "I was there," so the world stops asking. Martha Pike arrived late, shaking rain from her cloak, expecting one birth. She walked into two. That is the first mark of coercion. You do not disclose the full situation until the witness is already trapped inside it. By early hours, between roughly 2:00 and 4:00 A, Amara delivered a boy. No fanfare. No registry. No blessing spoken where it could be heard beyond the walls. The baby's first cries were treated as a threat. I want you to hear the ugliness in that. An infant's cry, a biological proof of life, becomes danger only because the wrong woman gave birth to him. That is not nature. That is ideology. It is a system that assigns innocence and guilt by skin and status, then calls the result order. Meanwhile, in a front bedroom, Vivian Harrow, Lenora Wainwright's cousin, was staged as the legitimate mother of a second infant. Vivian's presence in the estate in November and December now makes sense. She did not come to help. She came to serve as a vessel for paperwork. Her body did not need to produce the child. Her name needed to claim him. That is how dynasties operate. They can outsource biology, but they cannot outsource legitimacy. Legitimacy requires a surname, a registry, and a woman willing to hold the lie as if it were her own child. Whether Vivian birthed anything that night is the question they wanted the world to chase, because chasing the wrong question exhausts the truth seeker. The household story was simple. Vivian delivered a child. Amara's baby was stillborn. One sentence to crown an heir, one sentence to bury a witness. Martha Pike was forced into the mechanics of that narrative. Not persuaded, forced. She was ushered from room to room under supervision. She was denied the calm isolation midwives need to work. She was spoken to in tones that told her exactly who controlled her future. Colonel Augustus Wainwright did not need to lay hands on Pike for her to understand the threat. His uniform and his name were enough. His wife's silence was enough. Doctor. Crow's eyes were enough. Pike's pen became a weapon aimed at truth, because they made sure she understood that her signature could buy her safety or sell her into ruin. This is how respectable families turn others into accomplices. They create a situation where the witness's survival depends on compliance. Before sunrise, 2 statements were drafted. This detail is non-negotiable because it is the cornerstone of the later collapse. The first statement, written in formal language, declared that Vivian Harrow delivered a living male infant at the Wainwright house on January 3rd, 1844. It described the birth in a way meant to satisfy church and county norms, with clean phrasing and no mention of complications. The second statement was shorter, colder, and meant to close a door. It declared that Amara Bell delivered a stillborn child the same night. No name assigned. No time recorded. No grave location. No witness signatures beyond Pike and Crow. 2 documents designed to exist side by side without ever being compared. That is the method. Separate the records so no one sees the contradiction. A lie is safest when it is compartmentalized. Here is what they did not expect. Paper remembers even when people pretend not to. Ink has habits. Hands have patterns. Fear leaves traces. The 2 statements were not written with the same ink. One was darker, fresher, and flowed smoothly. The other looked like it had been rushed, as if the writer wanted to be done quickly. Pike's handwriting on the stillborn line wavered. Crow's signature on the same page was firm. That difference matters. It suggests who felt threatened and who felt protected. Pike was a tool. Crow was a collaborator. Then came the step that made the crime complete: the registry manipulation. On the Wainwright property, the Bible registry carried symbolic power. It was treated as a family altar of legitimacy. In the early morning hours, someone, most likely Lenora or a trusted elder, prepared the page where James Harrow would later appear. Not as Amara's son, not as Wainwright's sin, as family. A child can be stolen without ever leaving the house if the paperwork escorts him across the boundary between property and heir. That boundary is not blood, it is ink. That is why the Wainwrights did not simply kill the baby. They chose the more profitable crime: theft of identity. Death erases, theft preserves value. What happened to Amara in the immediate aftermath is what people soften with euphemisms like "sent away." Do not soften it. She was removed from sight because her existence threatened the story. She was kept weak, kept quiet, kept controlled. She was not allowed to carry the child openly, because a mother holding her baby invites questions the household could not answer. The baby, Amara's baby, was moved toward the main house, carried by hands that did not belong to his mother. This was done quickly, before daylight brought routine back, before servants' schedules created opportunities for observation. The goal was to ensure that by breakfast time, the household's lie felt established, like it had always been true. And the stillborn claim? It served a specific function. It cut off inquiry. A stillborn child requires no baptism, no future schooling, no inheritance conversation, no public milestones. A stillborn child cannot return at 20 to ask who he is. It is the perfect lie for an empire that wants to erase its crimes without leaving a body. But even that lie had a weakness. It required a grave, or at least a convincing absence. The Wainwrights provided neither. No marker in the family plot. No record in the local church burial list. No pastor's note. Just a sentence on a paper that could be filed away and forgotten, if forgetting was guaranteed. This is the moral point that polite storytellers avoid. The lie required an entire community's cooperation. Not everyone needed to know the details. Most only needed to accept the conclusion. The slave girl lost her baby. The cousin had a son. The colonel's house remains honorable. Those phrases are not neutral. They are the language of collective complicity. When a society repeats those phrases without demanding evidence, it becomes an accomplice to the theft. The Wainwrights counted on that. They counted on racism to do the heavy lifting, on the assumption that no one would value a black mother's testimony over a white family's registry. Remember the sequence because sequence is proof. April 12th, 1843. The summons. May 1843. The ledger entry and the missing page. July 1843. The hush payment to Mercer. November 1843. Vivian Harrow's arrival. January the 3rd, 1844. The storm, the 2 rooms, the 2 statements, the stillborn line, the child carried into the main house. This is not a tragedy that fell from the sky. It is a coordinated operation. If you want to claim innocence in the face of coordination, you must explain every step. And they could not. That is why, decades later, the dynasty would not be undone by a rumor or a grudge, but by documents, dates, and the body itself, because bodies carry the marks that paperwork cannot fully rewrite. But for now, in January 1844, the Wainwright house believed it had succeeded. It believed that by sunrise it had created a new reality. It believed that silence would hold. They were wrong. Silence is never permanent. It only waits for the right hand to open the drawer where the truth was locked. February 1844. The Wainwright estate did not celebrate. It stabilized. That is what criminals do after a successful operation. They move from execution to maintenance. The baby who should have been recorded as Amara Bell's son was carried into a different category, heir, while the woman who gave him life was forced into the category the law reserved for her. Property. This is where the theft becomes administrative, where violence puts on clean gloves and calls itself procedure. Colonel Augustus Wainwright understood that a lie is not complete until it can travel. A lie that stays in one house rots. A lie that moves through ports and parishes becomes history. On paper, the transfer began with a document designed to look ordinary. A bill of labor assignment dated February 11th, 1844, stamped with the Wainwright crest and signed by Wainwright's aide, Lieutenant Edwin Vale. Vale is not a footnote. He is the bridge between military authority and plantation secrecy, the man who made sure orders could be carried out without the colonel's name appearing where it shouldn't. The bill did not describe Amara as a mother. It described her as a household labor unit to be temporarily relocated for health and discipline. That phrase, health and discipline, was the estate's favorite two-word coffin. It meant remove her from witnesses and ensure obedience through fear. The document further assigned Amara to a holding farm outside Baton Rouge under Overseer Clyde Mercer, the same man who began receiving extra rations in July 1843. Follow the money and you will find the machinery. February 18th, 1844. Volley's travel receipt places him on the New Orleans River route, not for pleasure, not for commerce, but for concealment. New Orleans was useful because it offered noise, ships, records, transient bodies, and officials who could be paid to not ask questions. If Wainwright needed a person to disappear without appearing dead, the river route was a conveyor belt. Amara was moved with minimal possessions, escorted under the language of transfer, and threatened under the reality of force. If anyone later tried to claim she agreed, remember this: enslaved people do not agree. They comply under coercion or they are punished. Consent cannot exist where refusal is legally punishable. This is the moment the household committed its most profitable crime, separating a mother from her child while claiming it was administrative necessity. Amara's baby did not travel with her. That separation was not an accident of logistics. It was the point. A black mother holding her child is a walking contradiction to a white family's invented registry. If Amara stayed on the estate with empty arms, she might speak. If she was removed to Mercer's farm, she would be isolated, exhausted, and denied proximity to anyone who could verify her claim. Isolation is not merely cruelty. It is evidence control. The next step was the renaming. Names are how empires launder theft. The infant was entered into household records as James Harrow, the surname selected for maximum utility. Harrow was Lenora Wainwright's maternal line, respectable enough to bear an heir without raising immediate questions about Wainwright's paternity. It also provided plausible distance. If the child grew and his features did not match Wainwright perfectly, the family could shrug and say, Harrow blood. They were not just hiding a pregnancy, they were engineering plausible deniability for decades. That kind of planning is not shame. It is intent. March 1844. The Harrow Family Bible Registry acquired its addition page. This page matters because it reveals the method of forgery. The main registry could not be rewritten without visible disruption, so an extra leaf was stitched or pressed into place, a clean sheet for a clean story. On it, James Harrow appears with a birth date, January 3rd, 1844, listed as though it were always meant to be there. No mention of Amara. No mention of the second statement. No mention of any complication. This is how history gets manufactured. Not by loud proclamation, but by small alterations that later generations treat as sacred fact. Back on Mercer's holding farm, Amara was converted from scandal risk to labor asset again. Clyde Mercer enforced the arrangement with the kind of discipline money buys. He did not need to beat her every day. He needed only to demonstrate that he could. He controlled her food, her sleep, her movements. The purpose was twofold: punish her for existing as evidence, and condition her into silence. By April 1844, the farm's log shows extra night locks and restricted travel permissions for new arrivals. Bien sûr des sommes mais sensuelles. Again, the language is dull. That dullness is intentional. Bureaucratic language exists to make brutality sound like weather. Now look at the larger architecture. Colonel Wainwright did not publicly claim the child. He did not need to. He needed the child to be raised inside the main house, in sight, with books and linen and etiquette, so that when the boy walked into town years later, people would see status before they saw questions. The child would be educated into belonging. That education was part of the theft. When you steal a child's identity, you also steal his origin story. You decide what he can remember. You decide what he is allowed to ask. You decide what he is allowed to become. That is why the household did not simply hide James in an attic. They placed him where legitimacy could be rehearsed daily. Lieutenant. Edwin Vale's role continued through 1844 and 1845 as a courier of silence. He carried letters between Wainwright and regional contacts. He delivered gifts that were really payments. A doctor's fee, a pastor's donation, a midwife's thank you, an overseer's stipend. Each payment served the same function: to ensure that if anyone remembered, they would remember privately. Powerful men rarely rely on one wall of protection. They build layers: fear, money, prestige, and paperwork, so that even if one layer cracks, the others hold. Here is what the Wainwrights did not fully control: the human instinct to witness. Not to intervene, intervention was dangerous, but to see, to record internally, to hold a truth in the mind like a seed. Servants saw the baby carried upstairs. Servants heard Amara's cries. Servants noticed when her arms were empty and her body still moved with postpartum pain. They also saw who benefited. They saw Lenora's tightened mouth, Crow's clipped sentences, Wainwright's sudden generosity to staff who stayed quiet. The plantation system thrives when witnesses are made to feel powerless, when they are trained to believe that observation without action is useless. That belief is another form of control. Because observation, over time, becomes testimony. And testimony, when it finds paper, becomes collapse. By late 1844, the public narrative solidified. Vivian Harrow had a son. The child is Harrow stock. Amara's baby was lost. Notice the asymmetry. One story was repeated with pride, the other with casual dismissal. That casual dismissal is the most revealing part. A society that dismisses a black mother's loss without evidence is a society trained to protect white inheritance. That is not merely prejudice. It is infrastructure. And Amara? She was not permitted to grieve publicly. Grief makes claims. Grief asks, "Where is my child?" The system cannot allow that question to be asked loudly. So it did what it always did. It treated grief as insubordination. The holding farm was a place designed to grind down the will, to turn personal history into muscle memory, to force a woman to live as if she never gave birth. But the body remembers. Milk comes in. Hormones crash. The mind loops. You can relocate a person, but you cannot relocate the truth out of her bloodstream. The Wainwrights were banking on exhaustion. They expected time to do their dirty work. This chapter is not about romance or fate. It is about chain of custody. A baby removed from his mother. A mother removed from witnesses. A name rewritten on paper. A family line fabricated through registry manipulation. A network of professionals paid to keep the machine quiet. This is what it means when people say slavery was not just forced labor, it was forced amnesia, enforced by documents. And if you think the crime ends when the ink dries, you misunderstand how dynasties function. The crime continues every day. The stolen identity is lived as truth. So remember the dates as indictments. February 11th, 1844. The Bill of Assignment. February 18th, 1844. Valleys River Route. March 1844. The Added Bible Page. April 1844. Mercer's Restrictions. These are not background details. They are the spine of the case. If you claim to value justice, you do not get to forget the administrative steps that made injustice permanent. You do not get to call it history and shrug. History is a courtroom, and forgetting is perjury. Comment if you've ever seen a family name protected more fiercely than the people harmed to preserve it. Harrow House, Baton Rouge. By then the lie had matured into routine, which is the most dangerous stage of any fraud. People stop checking because they start living inside it. James Harrow was 4, dressed in miniature coats, taught to hold a spoon like entitlement was natural law. The household called him Master James in the same breath they called Amara Bell girl, even when she was no longer there to hear it. This is how stolen identity functions. It doesn't just change paperwork, it trains mouths. And once mouths are trained, the lie becomes culture. But culture is not evidence. Culture is what happens when evidence is buried and the living are told to forget. The Wainwrights believed they had neutralized the only threat: the mother. They underestimated the body. Because bodies do not comply the way records do. The child carried a mark the family could not redact, a signature written beneath the skin. On James's left shoulder sat a distinct birthmark shaped like a broken crescent, the color of darkened wine, uneven at the edges as if it had been stamped in haste. It was not a blemish the household could explain away as a Harrow quirk. It was too specific, too memorable. And in a household where servants handled bathing water and laundry, the mark was not private. It became known, then whispered, then used as a silent warning. This boy belongs to a story nobody is allowed to tell. Lenora Wainwright noticed it early. She was not a woman who missed details. She missed morals. In late summer 1848, during a dressing routine, she ordered the nurse to turn the child toward the window. Light on skin, eyes narrowed, lips pressed. She did not ask, "Is he well?" She asked, "Has anyone spoken of this?" That question is the whole case in miniature. Health was irrelevant. Secrecy was everything. And secrecy requires surveillance. After that inspection, servants reported stricter instructions. James would be bathed by fewer hands, dressed in closed collars more often, and kept from rough play that might expose the shoulder in public. Those restrictions were not maternal care. They were evidence management. 1849 to 1852. The household refined the choreography. James was raised as a Harrow, but protected like a Wainwright secret. He attended church in tailored jackets, even in warm months. He was taught to stand with his left side angled away when greeting visitors. Small habits, taught early, become lifelong reflex. You think you're teaching manners, you're teaching concealment. This is what the dynasty did to a child. It trained him to hide the one thing that could eventually free him from the lie, because the lie benefited everyone except the people it harmed. Meanwhile, far from Harrow House, Amara Bell did what the Wainwrights never accounted for. She kept a record. Not a legal record. She was denied that. A human record. In 1848, on Mercer's holding farm, she stitched a scrap of cloth with a date. 1-3-1844. She did not stitch poetry. She stitched a claim. A date is a weapon when your oppressor relies on vagueness. And below the date, she stitched a sentence as stark as an affidavit. He has the moon on his shoulder. Moon. Not romance. Description. She was describing the broken crescent birthmark in language she could remember even if they beat her for speaking it aloud. This is what responsibility looks like under oppression. You turn memory into artifact because you know the world will try to argue you out of your own truth. A house servant named Ruthie Lane entered the orbit of Harrow House. Her position was low, her eyes were sharp, and her survival depended on reading faces. Ruthie would later become the kind of witness families hate. The witness who saw patterns. She observed that Lenora's attention spiked whenever James's collar slipped. She observed that Dr. Silas Crow made more frequent visits than a healthy child required, and that those visits ended with closed-door conversations. Crow was not treating illness. He was monitoring risk. Crow, who tore pages in 1843, now tried to manage the consequences of what he helped create. He could not erase the mark. He could only advise concealment and attempt to normalize it as a harmless stain. Harmless. That word is always deployed when harm is profitable. James turned 12. At 12, children begin to ask about resemblance, ancestry, why adults speak in half sentences. The household responded the way households of fraud always respond, with discipline and distraction. James was given gifts, books, lessons, privileges. They fed him comfort to starve his questions. But questions do not die. They adapt. When James asked why his shoulder looked different, he was told it was nothing, that all families have marks, that he should not be vain. Moral language used to silence curiosity, another recurring tactic. Lenora positioned herself as the guardian of humility, when in reality she was the guardian of a stolen lineage. 1860 to 1863. The region tightened with war talk, the air heavy with imminent change. When systems are threatened, secrets become more volatile, not less. The Wainwright-Harrow household grew more paranoid. James's social exposure was managed carefully. The birthmark was treated like contraband. Ruthie Lane later recalled a moment in 1861 when James returned from a day outside with his collar torn, the shoulder mark briefly visible. Lenora's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. She struck the boy's shoulder hard enough to leave redness, not out of anger at a torn shirt, but out of terror at exposure. You do not strike a child for fabric. You strike him because his body is evidence you cannot control. That moment is important because it demonstrates the household's true relationship to James. They did not love him as a child. They protected him as a container for legitimacy. Now, pay attention to the moral inversion. James, the stolen child, was raised inside privilege that did not belong to him by consent, while Amara, the mother, was kept in deprivation that did not belong to her by justice. This is not to blame James. He was a victim of theft as much as he was a beneficiary of it. A stolen identity is not a gift. It is a trap. Because the day truth arrives, every comfort becomes stained, every memory becomes suspect, and the person who lived the lie is forced to carry guilt for a crime they did not orchestrate. The orchestrators count on that confusion. They count on the victim of identity theft to defend the lie because the lie feels like home. That is how dynasties recruit their own evidence into self-protection. Underneath all this, the Wainwrights believed time itself would act as a solvent. 20 years is a long sentence for a secret, but they thought it would be enough. They thought witnesses would die, memories would blur, paperwork would be misfiled, and a black woman's claim would dissolve into the background noise of history. They did not respect the discipline of remembrance. Amara's stitched cloth was not decorative, it was an indictment waiting for a courtroom. Ruthie's observations were not gossip, they were testimony waiting for an oath. And the birthmark, unhideable, unerasable, was the physical exhibit the family could never fully suppress. You can control mouths. You cannot control skin. So, if you want to know when the dynasty began to fail, do not look for a dramatic confrontation. Look for the small moments when control slipped. A collar torn, a window inspection, a doctor's unnecessary visit, a servant's silent note in her mind. These are the hairline cracks. Dynasties do not collapse from one blow. They collapse from accumulated truth pressing against a lie that was never structurally sound. Remember what this chapter proves. The conspiracy was not a single night in 1844. It was an ongoing project across years. It required maintenance, surveillance, behavioral training, and psychological pressure on a child and a network of coerced silence around him. That is why this is not merely a scandal. It is an operation. And operations leave patterns. Patterns can be testified to. Patterns can be documented. Patterns can destroy families that built themselves on theft. October 9th, 1864. Colonel Augustus Wainwright died the way powerful men often die, surrounded by property and praise, with unfinished confessions treated as private inconvenience rather than public responsibility. His death did not close the case. It froze it in a posture of respect, which is just another form of protection. In the days following the funeral, the household performed grief as ceremony while quietly securing what mattered. Control of records, control of rooms, control of any object that might speak when people refused to. A dynasty's first instinct after the patriarch's death is not remembrance. It is inventory. Wainwright's office became a sealed compartment. Not symbolically sealed, physically. The door was locked, then the lock was reinforced, and the key was held by Lenora Wainwright. The public explanation was mourning. The private reality was evidence containment. Within that office sat the only items that could connect the April 12, 1843, summons to the 3rd of January, 1844 swap with the clean line of motive in between. Correspondence, receipts, and the kind of draft letters powerful men write when they want credit for guilt without consequences. The household knew that paper does not feel loyalty. Paper only feels pressure, fire, water, and time. So they chose time, because time looks polite. Time feels like nature. Time is the alibi families use when they are afraid to burn things and be caught. Doctor. Silas Crowe made himself indispensable in those days. He was not family, but he functioned like a trusted technician of the lie. He had served the Wainwrights by tearing out medical evidence in 1843. Now he served them by controlling what happened to the office contents. On October 12, 1864, Crowe issued an order, written as if it were medical advice, stating that the colonel's cabinet should remain closed to preserve documents from damp and handling during the grieving period. The phrasing was clinical. The intent was criminal. Crowe understood the truth was not merely inside the cabinet. The truth was the cabinet. The mere fact of something being locked away creates curiosity. But curiosity can be managed. A locked cabinet in a dead man's office can be treated like a shrine. A shrine discourages rummaging. Then came the decision that reveals just how coordinated this was. The cabinet was nailed shut. Not simply locked. Nailed. Wood to wood, metal through grain. A literal barrier meant to outlast casual access. Crow himself supervised it. That detail matters because it proves he understood the cabinet contained more than ordinary papers. No physician nails shut a cabinet because of damp. A man nails shut a cabinet because he fears what will happen if someone opens it with clean hands and open eyes. The nails were the dynasty's confession without words. There is something here that cannot be allowed to breathe. For nearly 2 decades, the cabinet remained in place, becoming part of the household's furniture of denial. Years passed. War ended. The region rebuilt itself in new legal language while preserving old instincts. James Harrow grew into a young man with schooling and reputation. By the early 1880s, he was treated as the Harrow legacy made flesh, an heir with polished manners and a future drafted for him long before he was old enough to understand he was living someone else's life. People praised Colonel Wainwright as a builder. That praise is part of the cover-up. When communities canonize men like Wainwright, they create a moral shield around his actions. They make it socially expensive to accuse the dead. They pressure the living to keep quiet out of respect. This is how respect becomes a tool for ongoing harm. But time does not erase guilt. It only delays consequences. And the delay itself becomes evidence of intent. A secret buried for 20 years is not a mistake. It is an ongoing choice repeated daily by everyone who benefits. Someone dusted that office. Someone walked past that nailed cabinet. Someone made sure no curious hand pried it open. Someone preserved the lie as carefully as others preserve heirlooms. May 17th, 1884. Exactly 20 years after the cabinet was sealed by practice and fear, a letter surfaced with the precision of an execution date. It arrived addressed to Judge Malcolm Redd, a county judge known for procedure, not sentiment, exactly the kind of man a dynasty fears when evidence is clean. The envelope bore Colonel Wainwright's wax seal, impressed with the crest the family used as authority. Wax is not just decoration. Wax is a statement. This is official. And the date, May 17th, 1884, was not incidental. It was timed. A letter is only dangerous when it is delivered. Whoever held it for 2 decades understood that. Holding a letter is an act. Releasing it is another act. Both acts belong in the chain of accountability. Let's be blunt. This was not a ghost speaking. It was a living hand choosing a moment. Someone kept the letter safe through years of upheaval and relocation, through household transitions and changing control of property. That means it was hidden deliberately. It was protected from fire, from water, from accidental loss. And then it was released when it could do maximum damage. The timing suggests calculation rather than accident. By 1884, the people who orchestrated the swap were older or dead. Their direct influence had weakened. Their ability to threaten witnesses had decayed. The dynasty may have looked stable from the outside, but stability breeds complacency. Complacency creates gaps. Gaps allow truth to slip through. What was in the letter? Not flowery confession. Not remorseful poetry. Wainwright was not a romantic. He was an administrator of power. The letter was reportedly structured like a statement. Dates, names, acknowledgments of actions. The kind of writing that reads like a man trying to control the narrative even as he admits to wrongdoing. He would not say, "I assaulted." He would say, "I took." He would not say, "I stole a child." He would say, "Arrangements were made." Language that distances the writer from violence while still placing him at the center of decisions. That is how guilty men write when they believe confession can be managed like any other asset. The household did not know the letter was coming. If they had, it would have vanished. That is what makes its arrival so lethal. It bypassed their gatekeeping. It did not go through Lenora's hands. It did not sit under Crow's eyes. It went directly to a judge. And when a secret passes from private control to public jurisdiction, it stops being a family matter. It becomes a record. Families can shame individuals into silence. They cannot shame the court's archive. That is why dynasties fear documentation more than gossip. Gossip can be smeared. Documents can be filed. Judge Red's receipt of delivery mattered as much as the letter itself. It created a timestamp, a formal acknowledgement that something entered the legal sphere on May 17th, 1884. Once that happens, you can no longer pretend it was just talk. The dynasty's defense, if it ever had one, began collapsing at that moment, because their entire strategy depended on keeping everything inside the house. Inside the office, inside the cabinet, inside the mouths that could be threatened. A letter sent outside is betrayal from within. Now look back to October 1864 and understand the moral geometry. The cabinet was nailed shut to prevent discovery, and yet the letter existed. That implies Wainwright prepared multiple contingencies. One secret locked away, another secret prepared for delivery under certain conditions. He did not trust even his own household. He knew his wife's loyalty was to the name, not to truth. He knew Crow's loyalty was to self-preservation. So he split the evidence. The cabinet for internal control. The letter for external impact, either as insurance, revenge, or a final attempt at shaping how history would judge him. Powerful men often want credit for their sins once they believe they cannot be punished for them. That is not repentance. It is vanity. The ethical indictment here is not complicated. If you hold a letter that proves a child was stolen and a mother was erased, and you keep it hidden for 20 years, you are not neutral. You are participating. Silence is an action. Delay is an action. The person who released the letter in 1884 did one righteous thing late, but lateness does not erase the harm done in the waiting. The harm compounded every year James lived under a false name and Amara lived under forced absence. Remembering is not a hobby. It is a duty. When you refuse to record wrongdoing, you become the handwriting of the oppressor. By May 1884, the dynasty still believed its story was safe because it had survived so long. That belief is common among the powerful. Survival is mistaken for innocence. But survival often just means no one had the right document at the right time. On May 17, 1884, the right document arrived. And once a sealed confession enters the hands of a judge, a family name stops being a shield. It becomes a target. June 2nd, 1884. Red County Courthouse. Put that date next to every earlier date like a line of charges, because this is the day the dynasty's private bookkeeping became public evidence. Judge Malcolm Red did not call it family trouble. He called it what it was. Fraud, coercion, and a manufactured bloodline maintained through threats and falsified records. That courtroom was not a stage for emotion. It was a room built for facts. And facts are exactly what the Wainwright-Harrow Empire spent 20 years trying to starve. The letter that arrived on May 17, 1884, was read aloud as an instrument, not a confession of the heart. It did not beg forgiveness. It did not weep. It named names. It named dates. It outlined arrangements. That is how Colonel Augustus Wainwright chose to speak from beyond his death, still controlling, still administrative, still treating human lives as entries in a ledger. He acknowledged Amarabelle's pregnancy and admitted that the child born on January 3, 1844 was his firstborn, taken from an enslaved woman and placed into the harrow line by design. He referenced Dr. Silas Crow's role with medical documentation and Lieutenant Edwin Vale's role in transport and paperwork. He did not say rape because powerful men rarely name their violence. They named their logistics. But the logistics were enough, because logistics create the chain of custody that courts can hold. Red did not stop at reading. He moved immediately to corroboration, because a dynasty can survive a letter if it can smear the letter as forgery or madness. That is why the first act after the reading was procedural. Establish authenticity. Wax seal inspected. Handwriting compared with known Wainwright correspondence. Paper quality checked against what the colonel used in the 1860s. This is where the family's confidence began to leak. They were used to controlling witnesses. They were not used to controlling a judge's method. Then Red summoned living testimonies. Not opinions, not recollections, but sworn statements tied to dates and documents. Ruthie Lane was brought in, older now, careful with her words, but steady with details. She testified that as early as 1848 she observed Lenora Wainwright inspect a distinctive birthmark on James Harrow's left shoulder and thereafter restrict who bathed him and how he dressed. She described the mark without embellishment. A broken crescent, wine dark, uneven, sitting high on the shoulder near the collarbone. She did not claim to know what it meant. She testified to what she saw, which is what witnesses must do when power tries to drown truth in speculation. Next came Martha Pike's sealed confession. The midwife. The outsider they thought they could frighten into a permanent silence. But fear ages poorly. It erodes. By 1884, Pike was no longer young, no longer easily threatened by a household that had once seemed untouchable. Her confession, kept sealed and produced under court instruction, confirmed the twin statement mechanism. One statement affirming a Harrow birth, another declaring Amar's child stillborn. She attested to being forced to sign both under intimidation and to being denied the normal conditions of a lawful delivery record. She did not need to dramatize the coercion. She simply described the arrangement. 2 rooms, 2 narratives, 1 family insisting on control. The court did what the dynasty never expected anyone to do. It placed the 2 documents side by side and let the contradiction speak. That is often all it takes. Comparison. Lies survive by isolation. Dr. Silas Crow was called next, and this is where the courtroom air turned colder. Crow had lived his life believing professional respectability could outlast guilt. In court, respectability becomes irrelevant. Only consistency matters. Red asked about the missing 1843 ledger page. Crow attempted a clinical shrug, records lost, pages damaged, time passed. But then Red introduced the nail-down order from October 12, 1864, the instruction Crow issued to keep the colonel's cabinet closed for preservation. And preservation. The word returned like a knife. Why preserve some papers but lose others? Why nail shut a cabinet if handling was the concern? Crow's answers became tighter, and in tight answers you can hear the pressure of truth trying to escape. When Crow claimed he acted for the family's peace, Red responded with the question that collapses every accomplice's defense. Peace for whom? The dynasty's attorneys tried their classic move. Shift the trial from evidence to character. They insinuated Amara Bell was promiscuous, as if a racist trope could erase a timeline. They implied Ruthie Lane held grudges, as if bitterness changes ink. They suggested Pike sought attention, as if attention can forge a wax seal. This is what the powerful do when they cannot contest facts. They attack the humanity of the witnesses. And it is precisely why moral responsibility includes memory. When a society forgets the pattern, it falls for it again. Every time you watch a victim's character put on trial while the perpetrator's paperwork goes unexamined, you are watching the same old system in a new suit. Then came the moment the Harrow family did not anticipate and could not control. The body as Exhibit A. The court demanded physical corroboration, not to humiliate James Harrow, but to end the dynasty's ability to hide behind maybe. On June 2, 1884, in open light, James was compelled to expose his left shoulder. The broken crescent birthmark appeared exactly where Ruthie Lane described it, exactly as Martha Pike's memory implied. And, most damaging of all, exactly as Amara Bell's stitched record, preserved through years of forced displacement, had stated, "He has the moon on his shoulder." That line, once just a mother's private insistence, became evidentiary alignment. 3 independent sources: servant witness, midwife confession, mother's artifact. That convergence is what destroys manufactured narratives. Not one accusation. Not one rumor. Convergence. James Harrow's face in that moment is not the core of the case, but it is the human cost the dynasty never cared to measure. He had been raised as heir, trained as belonging, and now learned that belonging was stolen property. A stolen identity is not a simple correction. It is an existential collapse. The court did not need James to confess anything. He had orchestrated nothing. He was the vessel of the fraud. But the dynasty needed him to remain a symbol, because symbols keep families upright. When the symbol cracks, everything behind it shows. Lenora Wainwright attempted her final defense. The sanctity of the family name, the stability of the community, the danger of digging up old wounds. Those phrases are not arguments. They are threats dressed as concern. They mean, let us keep what we stole because we have already enjoyed it for so long. Judge Red refused that logic. He stated, flatly, that the length of a lie does not convert it into truth. He described the registry manipulation as a manufactured bloodline. He described the transfer documents as instrumental in the concealment of unlawful conduct. He recognized what the dynasty tried to deny. The fraud was not a private sin. It was a public crime with public consequences, because it altered inheritance, social standing, and the legal identity of a human being. This is the point where the family's internal architecture began collapsing outward. Allied families distanced themselves. Business partners hesitated. Church leaders stopped using the Harrow name as moral decoration. The dynasty that relied on reputation discovered that reputation is brittle when it is built on theft. And yet, even here, some townspeople still tried to soften it. They said, "It was a different time." That phrase is not an explanation. It is an attempt to launder guilt through history. A different time still had truth. A different time still had mothers. A different time still had stolen children. If a time permits crime, the moral obligation is not to excuse it, it is to remember it precisely so it cannot be repeated under new names. June 2nd, 1884 did not restore Amara Bell's stolen years. Courts are good at declaring facts and poor at giving back life. But the hearing did what the dynasty feared most. It converted a buried story into public record. It made forgetting harder. It forced the community to confront the machinery it had tolerated. And it revealed the final lesson of this document. When power hides behind paper, the only antidote is disciplined documentation, dates, signatures, patterns, and the courage to place them side by side. Remembering is not sentiment. It is prosecution. July 14th, 1884. Final ruling filed in Red County. The dynasty wanted a quiet ending, sealed records, private settlements, a polite agreement to move on. Judge Malcolm Red gave them the opposite. A written decision that treated their story not as gossip, not as scandal, but as a constructed system of deception. The ruling did not pretend it could repair what was stolen. It did not offer the sentimental lie of closure. It did what courts do at their best. It named what happened, identified how it was done, and placed the truth where it could not be easily reburied, inside the public record. That, by itself, was a punishment the Wainwright Harrow House had spent 20 years trying to avoid. For them, money could absorb fines. Pride could absorb insults. But a documented verdict? A documented verdict is an infection that spreads through every handshake, every marriage negotiation, every sermon that once used their name as moral decoration. Red's language was cold, almost surgical. He wrote that the Harrow lineage, as presented in church and county registries, was manufactured by deliberate misrepresentation. He noted the coordinated acts. The dual birth statements of January 3rd, 1844, the transfer and relocation of Amara Bell in February 1844, the subsequent raising of the child under a false surname, and the continued suppression of corroborating documentation, including the missing medical ledger page in the nailed cabinet order. He treated these not as isolated events but as a continuous fraud maintained through time. This framing matters. The dynasty's defense depended on compartmentalization. That was long ago. That was someone else's decision. That was private. Red stripped away the compartments and showed a single architecture. A crime that continued every day. The false identity was lived as truth. But here is the part the ruling could not do and did not pretend to do. It could not restore Amara Bell's life. Courts can move property lines, void contracts, alter inheritance. They cannot return 20 years of separation, 20 years of forced absence, 20 years of a mother being treated as disposable evidence. That is the hard moral center of this story. The legal system that once allowed a black woman to be legally erased does not become righteous simply because it later writes a verdict. A verdict is not redemption. It is recognition. Recognition is necessary, but it is not mercy. Amara's name entered the record formally. That alone was an inversion of what the dynasty had demanded. Her erasure. Yet even that recognition carried a bitter weight. To be named in a court file after being denied personhood is not a victory in the ordinary sense. It is a document proving what she endured and what others profited from. The ruling recognized that the child known as James Harrow was born of Amara Bell and Colonel Augustus Wainwright, and that the identity swap was executed under coercive conditions inherent to enslavement. Red's phrasing made something explicit that society had long tried to keep implicit. A black woman under slavery cannot consent to a powerful man's claim. The word consent, in that context, is a lie used to make violence sound like romance. Red did not romanticize. He indicted. The family's empire reacted like any organism exposed to light after years in a cellar. It convulsed. Within days of the June hearing, business associates began withdrawing. By late June 1884, Several contracts tied to Harrow land operations were paused, pending clarification. That word, clarification, is cowardice dressed as prudence. People wanted to distance themselves without admitting they had benefited from proximity to theft. Church elders who had once seated Harrows in prominent pews suddenly discovered neutrality. Social clubs adjusted invitations. The dynasty's allies did not rush to defend them on principle. They recalculated on risk. That is a useful lesson. Reputations are alliances of convenience, not proof of virtue. The Harrows had been treated as honorable because they were powerful, and now they were treated as tainted because power had cracked. Morality did not change. Incentives did. Inside the household, Lenora Wainwright's strategy shifted from denial to containment. She could no longer insist the story was false. She insisted it should be irrelevant. She urged the town to leave the past in the past. She framed public attention as cruelty. Notice the maneuver. The people harmed by the lie were asked to be quiet for the comfort of the people who benefited from it. That is the oldest move of injustice. Demand peace without accountability. Demand silence as forgiveness. Demand forgetting as virtue. It is not virtue. It is maintenance of hierarchy. James, now forced to confront that his life was built on a stolen foundation, became the battlefield where the dynasty fought for sympathy. They wanted him to be seen as the true victim so the mother could be forgotten again. It is true that James was harmed. A stolen identity is a form of violence. It fractures the self. It makes memory unstable. It turns childhood into evidence. But his harm does not cancel Amara's harm. The dynasty wanted a single victim because a single victim is easier to manage. A mother's harm is inconvenient because it points back to the original perpetrator and the system that protected him. The ruling made clear that both were true. James was a victim of fraud. Amara was a victim of slavery, assault, and erasure. The difference is that Amara's victimhood was engineered by law, not merely exploited by it. Assets became a battlefield. The ruling triggered disputes over inheritance and legitimacy. The Harrow name had functioned as a key that opened property and authority. Now that key was questioned. Not every asset was confiscated. Courts rarely dismantle a dynasty completely, because dynasties are woven into local economies and political networks. But the most important confiscation was intangible. Certainty. Once certainty was gone, everything became contestable. Titles, land claims, family trusts, even marriages arranged under assumptions of bloodline. A dynasty can survive poverty better than it can survive uncertainty. Poverty can be explained away as misfortune. Uncertainty invites examination. Examination invites further discoveries. Discoveries invite more collapse. And still, in July 1884, you can hear the town splitting into two moral camps. One camp demanded accountability. The records were clear. The witnesses converged. The mark was undeniable. The other camp clung to comfort. He was a respected colonel. The family has done much good. Why stir hatred? This second camp is how societies stay guilty while pretending to be civilized. They treat truth as stirring and lies as stability. They treat exposure as cruelty and concealment as grace. They talk about unity the way criminals talk about alibis. Unity without truth is just coordinated silence. If you want a final lesson, take it from what the ruling could not accomplish. It could not unteach the town its habits. It could not force people to value a black mother's history as much as they valued a white family's reputation. That work is cultural, moral, and personal. It is carried by individuals who decide, deliberately, to remember. Remembering is not passive. It is not knowing. It is insisting that names and dates remain attached to actions so that comfort cannot dissolve guilt. The Wainwright-Harrow household relied on the opposite. That time would detach actions from names, that the dead would be praised and the living would be pressured to move on. The letter, the mark, the testimonies, and the ruling interrupted that plan. They created an obligation that extends beyond the courtroom. To record what happened accurately, to refuse the soft language that turns crimes into family matters, and to treat the erasure itself as part of the violence. So write it plainly. April 12, 1843. Colonel Wainwright summoned Amara Bell under coercive power. January the 3rd, 1843. The child was born and the identity swap was executed through dual statements. February 1844. Amara was relocated and silenced through transfer documents. October 9th, 1864. Wainwright died and evidence was locked behind nails in reverence. May 17th, 1884. The letter entered the judge's hands. June 2nd, 1884. The mark and the documents converged in court. July 14th, 1884. The verdict made the lie official in reverse, recorded not as lineage, but as fraud. This is not a legend. It is a case study in how power tries to rewrite biology and how the truth returns anyway, not because the world is fair, but because someone chose to preserve a record and someone else chose to read it aloud. The dynasty did not collapse because fate punished them. It collapsed because evidence was finally treated as more sacred than a surname. That is the only kind of justice history reliably offers. Not cosmic balance, but human insistence. And that insistence is fragile. It requires witnesses. It requires memory. It requires you, now, to refuse the final request every dynasty makes when it is caught. Forget.